"You're in the wrong building, sir." The receptionist said it with polite firmness, sliding the visitor badge back across the marble desk as if she were returning a lost wallet. For a moment, the entire lobby seemed to hold its breath. The man standing in front of her did not look angry. He did not even look surprised. He simply looked around the towering glass atrium, the polished steel elevators, the wall-sized digital screen displaying the name of the company in glowing blue letters. Halle Meridian Holdings. His company. Yet 2 security guards were already stepping closer, their radios crackling softly. One of them gestured toward the revolving doors. "Sir, employees only beyond this point. If you have business here, you will need to schedule an appointment." The man glanced at the massive company logo above the reception desk again, as though confirming something quietly to himself. Then he lowered his eyes and gave a small, calm nod that confused everyone watching. Because instead of arguing, he reached into his coat pocket and slowly removed a simple leather wallet. Before continuing, comment where in the world you're watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. The lobby of Hale Meridian Holdings sat in the heart of downtown Chicago, surrounded by glass towers and traffic that never seemed to stop moving. The building itself stretched 42 floors into the skyline, a monument to corporate success and quiet power. Every morning executives in tailored suits walked through those doors carrying coffee cups and tablets, discussing mergers worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But the man standing at the reception desk that morning looked nothing like the men who usually walk those halls. His suit was dark but simple. His shoes were polished but worn from long travel. And the security guards had already made up their minds about him before he spoke a single word. The receptionist glanced briefly at the badge scanner beside her keyboard. "I am sorry, sir," she repeated gently, "but if you are here for maintenance deliveries, those go through the service entrance on the east side of the building." One of the guards nodded toward the street. "You can walk around the block, and they will help you there." Several employees waiting near the elevators exchanged quick glances. Someone quietly chuckled under his breath. The man at the desk seemed to hear everything, but he remained calm. His eyes moved slowly across the lobby, studying the framed photographs of the company early days mounted along the wall. One picture showed the first office, barely larger than a small apartment. Another showed the groundbreaking ceremony for this very tower 15 years earlier. In that photograph, a younger man stood holding a golden shovel beside city officials and investors. The security guard tapped the counter again. "Sir, you need to head outside now." The man finally looked back at him. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but steady. "The photograph on the wall," he said slowly, "the one from the groundbreaking ceremony." The guard frowned slightly. "What about it?" The man met his eyes with a calm expression that somehow made the entire lobby feel colder. "I am a man holding the shovel in that picture, and I built this company." The security guard blinked once, then glanced over his shoulder toward the wall of framed photographs. For a brief moment, uncertainty flickered across his face, but it vanished just as quickly. "People say a lot of things in this building, sir," he replied with a short breath of amusement. The receptionist shifted uncomfortably in her chair, unsure whether to laugh or remain silent. Several employees standing near the elevator bank had stopped pretending not to listen. One woman lowered her phone slowly, watching the scene unfold with quiet curiosity. The man at the reception desk remained still, the leather wallet resting calmly in his hand. He opened it without hurry and slid a single card onto the marble counter. The receptionist hesitated before picking it up. The card was simple. Thick white stock, black lettering, no flashy logo. Just a name printed clearly across the center. Daniel Hale, Founder and Chief Executive Officer. Halle Meridian Holdings. Her eyes lingered on the card longer than expected. Then she looked back up at the man standing before her. For a moment, she searched his face carefully, comparing the man in front of her with the photograph she had passed every morning for the past 3 years. The man in the photograph looked younger, more polished, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent. But the eyes were the same, calm, observant, unmoved by the tension in the room. The security guard leaned over the desk. "What does it say?" The receptionist swallowed lightly. It says he is the founder. The guard snorted softly. That is convenient. He folded his arms across his chest and gave the man a measured look that carried more irritation than doubt. Sir, people try that trick all the time. Fake business cards are not exactly rare in this city. Daniel Hale did not react to the sarcasm. Instead, his gaze drifted once more across the lobby. He studied the polished floors, the curved reception desk, the massive digital display cycling through corporate achievements and quarterly growth statistics. His voice was calm when he spoke again. When we first rented our office space, we were on the 8th floor of a building on Lake Street. The elevators broke down twice a week. In the summer, the air conditioner failed so often that employees brought desk fans from home. The guard frowned slightly. Daniel continued as if he had not heard him. There were 5 of us in that first office. 2 folding tables. 3 borrowed chairs. 1 second-hand printer that jammed every time someone tried to print more than 10 pages. A young analyst near the elevators quietly stepped closer, drawn in despite himself. Daniel gestured gently toward the framed photographs again. That photograph from the groundbreaking ceremony was taken 15 years ago on a cold morning in early November. The wind coming off Lake Michigan was so strong it knocked over the podium before the mayor even finished his speech. A few nervous laughs rippled through the small crowd watching. The guard shifted his weight, but did not step away. Daniel finally returned his eyes to the receptionist. Your name is Emily, correct? She blinked in surprise. Yes. You started working here 3 years ago after graduating from Northwestern University. Your father sent flowers on your first day. They were yellow roses. The receptionist stared at him, her expression suddenly uncertain. How did you know that? Daniel Hale gave a faint smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Because Emily, he said gently, every person hired at Hale Meridian Holdings since the beginning has passed across my desk. The lobby grew quiet again, the kind of quiet that spreads slowly through a room when people begin to realize something they did not expect. The security guard looked back at the photograph on the wall once more. This. Tommy did not laugh. The silence in the lobby did not break all at once. It loosened slowly, like ice cracking across the surface of a frozen lake. The security guard shifted his weight again, his earlier confidence fading into something less certain. He studied the photograph on the wall more carefully now, comparing the younger man holding the ceremonial shovel with the quiet figure standing at the reception desk. The resemblance was no longer easy to dismiss. But pride is a stubborn thing, and admitting a mistake in front of a growing audience is never easy. The guard cleared his throat and straightened his jacket. Even if that story is true, sir, he said carefully, company policy still requires identification verification. Anyone can memorize details about a business. Daniel Hale nodded slowly, as though he had expected the resistance. Of course, he replied in the same calm tone. Verification is important. That principle built this company. He slid the wallet back into his coat pocket and rested both hands lightly on the edge of the marble counter. The lobby lighting reflected faintly off the polished surface, casting a soft glow across his face. For a moment he said nothing more, and the quiet allowed the employees nearby to continue studying him. It was strange how quickly curiosity spreads in a workplace. A few minutes earlier, most of them had been focused on emails, meetings, and deadlines. Now several analysts, assistants, and junior managers lingered near the elevators, pretending to check their phones while secretly listening. Daniel noticed them, but he did not acknowledge the attention. Instead, his thoughts seemed to drift somewhere far beyond the glass walls of the building. 15 years earlier, he had stood on an empty lot only 2 blocks from this very spot. At that time, there had been no tower, no polished lobby, no digital screens celebrating revenue milestones. Just a muddy construction site surrounded by chain-link fencing and the constant noise of traffic rolling through downtown Chicago. The groundbreaking ceremony had been small. A few investors, a handful of reporters, one skeptical city council member who openly questioned whether a young black entrepreneur with limited connections could ever compete in the financial technology world. Daniel remembered the look on that council member face when he said it. Not angry, not openly hostile, just certain. Certain that someone like Daniel Hale did not belong at the center of a billion-dollar vision. That certainty had followed him through most of his life. It had followed him back when he was a boy growing up in a narrow brick house on the south side of Chicago. His mother worked double shifts as a nurse assistant at a neighborhood clinic. His father drove a city bus along the same route for more than 20 years. Money was always tight. Some winters the heating system failed, and the family slept beneath heavy blankets while wind pushed through the old window frames. Yet Daniel's childhood had never felt small. His parents believed deeply in discipline, education, and patience. His father used to say something every Sunday evening before the new work week began. The world will tell you who it thinks you are, but your work will tell the world who you truly are. Daniel carried that sentence with him through high school, through college, through every rejection letter and every skeptical meeting that followed. He remembered the first time a venture capital firm laughed when he presented his early software concept. The senior partner leaned back in his chair and said the market was not ready for an idea like that from someone with his background. Daniel left that office quietly and returned to work the next morning anyway. One small improvement at a time, one customer at a time, one long night after another. That persistence slowly turned a small software experiment into a growing financial platform, then into a company, then into the tower standing around them now. The security guard watched him closely, noticing the distant look in his eyes. "Sir," he said more carefully this time, "if you truly are Daniel Hale, then someone upstairs will confirm it soon enough." Daniel looked back at him and gave a calm nod. "That is fair." His gaze drifted upward toward the glass elevators rising through the center of the building. 15 years, he said softly, almost to himself. And somehow this place still feels brand new. The elevators continued to glide up and down through the center of the glass atrium, carrying employees to meetings that had suddenly become less important than the quiet tension spreading through the lobby. Daniel Hale stood calmly at the reception desk while the room slowly adjusted to the possibility that something unusual was unfolding. The security guard had stepped slightly to the side now, no longer blocking the exit but still watching Daniel with guarded skepticism. The receptionist, Emily, held the business card between her fingers, reading the name again as if repetition might reveal whether the moment was real or a misunderstanding. Around them, several employees had stopped pretending to leave. A young analyst whispered something to a colleague. Someone near the elevators quietly searched Daniel Hale on a phone screen, eyes widening as the official company biography appeared beside a photograph that looked increasingly familiar. At that moment, the glass doors of the lobby opened again, and a man in a sharp charcoal suit walked in with quick, purposeful steps. His name was Victor Langston, the Senior Operations Director for Hale Meridian Holdings. Most employees in the building recognized him immediately. Victor carried authority the way some people carry expensive watches. It was visible in the way people stepped aside when he approached. His schedule was usually filled with executive meetings, investor calls, and strategic planning sessions on the upper floors. But that morning a message from security had interrupted his routine. There's a man in the lobby claiming to be the founder. Victor had laughed when he first heard it. That kind of situation happened in large companies more often than people realized. Someone confused, someone looking for attention, someone hoping to sneak past security by pretending to be important. But as he stepped into the lobby now, the quiet tension immediately caught his attention. The employees standing near the elevators looked uneasy. The receptionist was pale. The security guard stood unusually still. Victor followed their gaze toward the reception desk. His eyes landed on Daniel Hale. For half a second, Victor's expression did not change. Then a faint crease appeared between his brows as he studied the man more closely. He had only seen Daniel Hale in person a few times during company events years earlier. The founder rarely visited the building these days. Most executive operations were handled remotely, while Daniel focused on global partnerships and long-term investment strategy. The man at the desk looked older than the photographs Victor remembered. The suit was simpler, the posture more relaxed, but the eyes were unmistakable, calm, observant, measuring everything in the room without appearing to try. Victor stopped walking. The entire lobby seemed to pause with him. The security guard noticed Victor's arrival and immediately spoke with renewed confidence. "Mr. Langston," he said, "this man claims he is Daniel Hale." The receptionist handed Victor the business card silently. Victor glanced down at it for only a moment before lifting his eyes again. Daniel watched him quietly, offering no greeting and no explanation. For several seconds, neither man spoke. The silence carried a different weight now. Employees who had been whispering moments earlier went completely quiet. Victor Langston was known for his sharp instincts and strict professionalism. If anyone could resolve the situation quickly, it would be him. Victor took a slow step closer to the desk. His gaze remained fixed on Daniel's face. Finally, he spoke in a controlled voice that carried clearly across the lobby. "Sir, if you truly are Daniel Hale, then you should know something very simple." Daniel raised one eyebrow slightly, curious but calm. Victor continued, "The founder of this company has not walked through this lobby unannounced in nearly 6 years." He paused, letting the words settle in the air. Then he added with a thin, polite smile, "So if you're who you claim to be, you will not mind answering a few questions before we let you upstairs." Victor Langston stood only a few feet away now, his posture straight and controlled, the kind of posture that came from years of boardroom negotiations and high-pressure decisions. The employees watching from across the lobby could feel the tension tightening like a wire between the two men. Victor was not smiling anymore. The thin, polite expression had faded into something sharper, something more professional and cautious. Daniel Hale met his gaze without blinking. The calm in his eyes had not changed since the moment he first walked into the building. Victor folded his hands lightly in front of him, as if he were beginning a formal interview. "Very well," he said. "Let's make this simple. If you're Daniel Hale, then you know the history of this company better than anyone." Daniel nodded once. "I would hope so." Victor gestured toward the large digital screen that hung above the reception area. The screen displayed a rotating timeline of the company milestones, achievements, and expansion announcements. Anyone who spent 5 minutes researching Hale Meridian Holdings could repeat those public facts. Victor understood that, and so he decided to begin somewhere deeper. "Tell me something that is not on that screen," he said. "Something only the founder would know." The lobby grew quiet again. Even the security guard seemed to lean slightly closer, curious now rather than dismissive. Daniel rested one hand on the marble desk and looked around the room slowly, as though searching for a memory hidden in the architecture itself. "When we moved from the Lake Street office to our second location," he began calmly, "we did not have enough money to replace the broken chairs. The new office had glass walls and polished floors, but the chairs were the same ones we used in the original space. One of them had a cracked leg that we kept fixing with duct tape." A few people watching near the elevators exchanged confused looks. Victor did not react. Daniel continued, "On the first day in that office, one of our junior programmers arrived 2 hours early because she was afraid the company would fail and she wanted to finish her work before it happened." Victor's eyes narrowed slightly. Daniel went on. "Her name was Carla Ramirez. She later built the algorithm that allowed our payment system to process transactions 3 times faster than our competitors." Victor remained silent, studying him carefully. Daniel's voice remained steady and unhurried. "That same year, we nearly lost our first major investor because the software crashed during a demonstration. The system froze for 12 minutes while everyone sat around the conference table pretending to stay calm. It was Carla who restarted the entire network manually from the server closet. When the system came back online, the investor said something I never forgot. Victor finally spoke again. "What did he say?" Daniel looked directly at him. "He said your company may not be perfect yet, but the people in this room refuse to quit. That is the kind of company worth investing in." The words hung in the air. Victor's expression changed slightly now, the skepticism beginning to soften. Daniel glanced toward the glass elevators again, watching one descend slowly from the upper floors. "The truth is," he continued quietly, "this company was never built by one person. It was built by people who believed that patience and discipline could outwork doubt." He paused, then looked back at Victor. "That belief is the only reason this building exists." The lobby remained silent for several long seconds. Victor Langston took a slow breath. He had spent nearly a decade helping run the operations of Hale Meridian Holdings. During that time, he had studied every public speech Daniel Hale had given, every interview, every leadership memo distributed across the company. Yet the story Daniel had just told was not in any of those records. Victor turned slightly and looked again at the photograph on the wall from the groundbreaking ceremony. Then he faced Daniel once more. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. It was quieter now, more careful. "Mr. Hale," he said slowly, "if you truly are the founder, then there is one more detail you should remember." Daniel waited calmly. Victor continued. "On the morning this building opened, there was a sentence you told the entire staff during the first company meeting in the lobby. It was not part of your speech. You said it after the microphone stopped working." Victor crossed his arms. "What was that sentence?" The employees nearby held their breath again, sensing that the answer would decide everything. The lobby remained perfectly still after Victor Langston finished speaking. The question he had asked seemed simple on the surface, yet everyone in the room sensed the weight behind it. The sentence he mentioned had never appeared in company newsletters or press releases. It had not been written in official history summaries or displayed on the digital screen above the reception desk. Only the people who stood in this building on the very first morning would remember it clearly. Victor watched Daniel carefully, searching for even the smallest sign of hesitation. But Daniel Hale did not rush to answer. Instead, he turned slightly and looked around the lobby again, letting his eyes move slowly across the glass walls, the polished floors, and the tall elevators rising through the center of the building. The memory returned to him easily. 15 years earlier, the lobby had looked very different. The walls had been bare. The marble floors still smelled faintly of fresh sealant. Boxes of office equipment were stacked in corners waiting to be carried upstairs. Nearly 100 employees had gathered in that same space for the first all-company meeting inside the new headquarters. They were excited, nervous, and proud all at the same time. Many of them had joined the company when it was still nothing more than a small group of programmers working long nights in a rented office. Daniel remembered standing at the front of the room that morning holding a microphone that refused to work properly. He had tried to begin his prepared speech 3 different times before the sound system finally failed completely. The employees had laughed, the kind of laughter that comes from people who already know each other well. Daniel slowly turned back toward Victor Langston. When a microphone stopped working, he said calmly, "I raised my voice and told everyone something that mattered more than the speech I planned to give." Victor's eyes narrowed slightly. The employees around the lobby leaned closer, sensing the moment approaching. Daniel continued in the same steady voice. "I told them that buildings do not build companies. People do." He paused briefly, letting the words settle in the quiet room. Then he continued. "I said that the glass walls around us were only decoration. The real strength of the company would always come from the character of the people standing inside those walls." A long silence followed. Victor Langston's expression changed almost immediately. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The skepticism that had filled his posture began to fade, replaced by a quiet recognition that traveled slowly across his face. He had been in the lobby that morning 15 years ago, not as an executive, but as a young operations assistant standing near the back of the crowd with a notebook in his hand. He remembered the broken microphone. He remembered the laughter. And he remembered those exact words spoken across the empty lobby before the building had even been fully furnished. Victor lowered his arms slowly. For the first time since he entered the room, he looked uncertain. Daniel watched the change calmly, but said nothing more. The employees near the elevators were now whispering openly. A few of them glanced again at the photograph on the wall, and then back at the man standing quietly at the reception desk. The resemblance was no longer easy to ignore. The security guard shifted his stance, suddenly aware that the situation might not be as simple as he had assumed earlier. Victor took one slow breath and stepped closer to Daniel. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its earlier sharp edge. It carried something else now, respect mixed with cautious disbelief. "I remember that morning," Victor said quietly. Daniel gave a faint nod. "Then you remember what happened next?" he replied. Victor hesitated. Daniel continued. After the meeting ended, one of the janitors came over and told me the microphone cable had been loose the entire time. Daniel allowed himself a small smile. He said he could have fixed it in 30 seconds if anyone had asked him earlier. Several employees laughed softly at the memory. Victor stood silent for a moment longer before finally speaking again. Mr. Hale, he said carefully, if you're truly the founder, then there is someone upstairs who will want to see you immediately. Daniel tilted his head slightly. Who would that be? Victor glanced toward the elevators before answering. The board of directors is holding a strategy meeting on the 38th floor this morning. He looked back at Daniel with a thoughtful expression. And according to the agenda, they're about to make a decision about the future of this company without expecting you to walk through the front door. The words Victor Langston had just spoken settled heavily over the lobby. The board of directors is holding a strategy meeting on the 38th floor this morning. For a moment, Daniel Hale did not move. His eyes lifted slowly toward the ceiling where the glass elevators slid silently up the tall atrium like transparent rivers of steel and light. 38 floors above them, the most powerful people connected to Hale Meridian Holdings were sitting around a long polished table, deciding the direction of the company he had built from nothing. Daniel had not been informed about the meeting. That detail alone told him more than Victor realized. The room around him remained quiet, but the energy had shifted. Employees who had once watched the scene with mild curiosity now looked at Daniel with a different expression entirely. Some were uncertain. Some were fascinated. A few seemed almost embarrassed by what had happened only minutes earlier. The security guard who had first tried to escort Daniel out of the building now stood very still beside the reception desk, as if hoping to become invisible. Victor studied Daniel carefully. He had expected surprise or perhaps irritation when he mentioned the board meeting upstairs. Instead, Daniel simply nodded once, absorbing the information without visible emotion. That reaction unsettled Victor more than anger would have. You were not told about the meeting, Victor said cautiously. Daniel's voice remained calm. No, he replied. I was not. Victor shifted his stance slightly, lowering his voice so that only those closest could hear. The board has been discussing several major decisions over the past few months. Some of them involve restructuring leadership roles and long-term control of the company. Daniel looked back at him with quiet interest. Control, he repeated softly. The word hung in the air for a moment. Daniel folded his hands loosely in front of him, his posture relaxed but attentive. 15 years earlier, he had learned that the most important moments in business often arrived without warning. Deals collapsed overnight. Opportunities appeared where none had existed the day before. And sometimes the people you trusted began making decisions in rooms you had not been invited into. Daniel's eyes moved again across the lobby, taking in the employees who had gathered nearby. Many of them were young professionals who had joined the company long after its early struggles. To them, Hale Meridian Holdings had always been a powerful corporation with global reach and advanced financial technology. They had never seen the long nights, the uncertain investors, or the cramped offices where the first versions of the software were written. Daniel wondered how many of them even knew that the company had started with only 5 employees and a borrowed printer. Victor cleared his throat gently. The meeting upstairs began 30 minutes ago, he said. Daniel glanced toward the elevators again. Through the glass shafts, he could see the faint reflection of the city skyline beyond the building. Chicago stretched outward in every direction beneath a pale morning sky. Daniel had spent most of his life in that city. It had shaped him, challenged him, and taught him patience when the world seemed determined to underestimate him. After a moment, he turned back to Victor. Tell me something, Daniel said quietly. Victor waited. Daniel continued. How long have you known about the discussion to restructure leadership? Victor hesitated. The question was direct, but not hostile. Several weeks, he admitted finally. Daniel nodded slowly, as though confirming a suspicion that had been forming in his mind. And no one thought it might be useful to inform the founder of the company, he said. Victor opened his mouth, but then stopped. The answer was obvious and uncomfortable at the same time. Around them, the lobby remained silent. Even a faint sound, of elevator cables moving through the walls seemed louder now. Daniel finally stepped away from the reception desk and walked a few slow paces toward the center of the lobby floor. The marble reflected the light above him, turning his shadow into a dark shape stretching across the polished surface. Victor watched him closely. For the first time since Daniel had entered the building, the founder expression changed slightly. It was not anger. It was something quieter and more thoughtful. Decisions made without the people who built the foundation often forget why the foundation exists, Daniel said calmly. Then he looked back at Victor with steady eyes. I think it is time we join that meeting upstairs. Victor Langston studied Daniel Hale for several seconds after hearing those words. I think it is time we join that meeting upstairs. The sentence was not loud, yet it carried a weight that seemed to travel across the entire lobby. Daniel had not raised his voice, had not shown anger, had not demanded authority. But the calm certainty in his tone made it clear that the moment for standing in the lobby had ended. Victor glanced toward the glass elevators again. 38 floors above them, the board of directors was sitting around a long walnut conference table reviewing financial projections, restructuring proposals, and leadership transition plans. Most of those people believed the founder was halfway across the country, handling investment negotiations. None of them expected him to appear in the building without warning. Victor finally nodded slowly. If you walk into that room right now, it will interrupt the meeting, he said carefully. Daniel gave a faint smile. It would not be the first time I interrupted a meeting in this company. The employees nearby watched in silence as Victor turned toward the elevator bank. The security guard stepped aside immediately this time, no longer attempting to block the path. Daniel walked across the polished marble floor with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years navigating rooms far more complicated than a corporate lobby. Victor followed beside him, still processing everything that had happened in the last 10 minutes. When the elevator doors opened, they stepped inside together. The mirrored walls reflected both men back at them, two very different figures standing in the same narrow space. Victor in his tailored executive suit, Daniel in the simpler travel-worn jacket. He had arrived in that morning. The doors closed with a soft mechanical sound, and the elevator began rising through the tall glass atrium. For several seconds, neither man spoke. The lobby shrank beneath them, the employees below becoming smaller figures looking upward through the transparent elevator shaft. Victor finally broke the silence. The board has been discussing a merger proposal with a large international firm, he said quietly. Daniel kept his eyes on the skyline visible through the glass wall of the elevator. A merger, he repeated. Victor nodded. They believe combining resources could double the company's global expansion within 5 years. Daniel's expression remained thoughtful. And what do you believe? Victor hesitated before answering. I believe some of them see it as an opportunity to consolidate control of the company leadership. Daniel turned his head slightly, studying Victor's face for the first time since they entered the elevator. That is an honest answer, he said. Victor allowed himself a small breath of relief. The elevator continued climbing past floor numbers that lit one by one above the door. 27, 28, 29. The view outside expanded as the city skyline stretched across the horizon in steel and glass. Daniel watched the passing floors quietly. The rhythm of the elevator reminded him of earlier years when he used to ride freight elevators late at night while checking on servers and software updates. Back then, the company had been small enough that he knew every employee name and every line of code written into the platform. Growth had changed that. Success had introduced new investors, new executives, and new layers of management. Some of those changes were necessary. Others carried risks he had always tried to watch carefully. The elevator slowed as it passed floor 35. Victor adjusted his jacket slightly. You should know something else before we reach the boardroom, he said. Daniel waited. Victor continued. Some members of the board believe the company founder role should become symbolic rather than operational. The word symbolic lingered in the air. Daniel did not react immediately. Instead, he looked upward at the ceiling of the elevator as if measuring the distance remaining before the doors opened again. After a moment, he spoke calmly. Symbols are useful when people forget the meaning behind them. Victor watched him closely. The elevator indicator changed to 38. The doors began to slow. Daniel straightened his posture slightly and faced the entrance. Whatever decision the board thinks they are making today, he said quietly, they deserve to make it with the full truth standing in the room. The elevator came to a gentle stop. The door slid open to reveal a quiet hallway leading toward the executive conference suite where the future of Hale Meridian Holdings was being decided. The hallway outside the executive conference suite was quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Thick carpet softened every step, and the tall glass windows along the wall revealed the vast skyline of Chicago stretching across the horizon. From this height, the city looked calm and orderly. But inside the conference room ahead, the future of Hale Meridian Holdings was being debated with the kind of intensity that only billions of dollars in control of a global company could create. Daniel Hale stepped out of the elevator first. His pace was steady, unhurried, as if he had walked this hallway 1,000 times before. Victor Langston followed half a step behind, his mind still turning over the events of the past few minutes. The quiet tension that had filled the lobby earlier had now condensed into something sharper. Up here, there would be no curious employees watching from the elevators and no whispered conversations among junior staff. Only the board of directors. Only the people who believed they had the authority to shape the company next chapter. At the end of the hallway, the double doors of the conference suite were closed. Through the frosted glass panels, faint voices could be heard, low and controlled, but clearly engaged in serious discussion. Daniel slowed as they approached. He did not reach for the door immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the large framed photograph mounted on the wall beside the entrance. It was a newer image taken only 3 years earlier during the company 10th anniversary celebration. In the photograph, Daniel stood at the center of a stage, surrounded by executives, engineers, and early investors. Many of those faces were now seated inside the room ahead. Some had believed in the company from the beginning. Others had joined later when success made the opportunity impossible to ignore. Victor stopped beside him. They're discussing the merger vote right now, he said quietly. Daniel nodded once. And the outcome? Victor hesitated before answering. If the vote passes, the international firm will receive significant influence over strategic leadership decisions. Daniel's eyes remained on the photograph. Influence, he repeated softly. The word sounded almost harmless, yet both men understood what it truly meant. Influence often becomes control when the right people are not present to challenge it. From inside the conference room, a voice rose slightly louder than the others. The board chairman was speaking. The merger offers stability and expansion that we cannot achieve alone. Several other voices murmured in agreement. Victor shifted his weight uneasily. They believe the company has outgrown the founder model of leadership, he said quietly. Daniel turned his head and looked directly at him. Companies do not outgrow principles, he replied calmly. They either protect them or forget them. The hallway fell silent again. Daniel reached forward and placed his hand on the polished metal door handle, but did not open it yet. He listened for a moment longer. Another board member spoke from inside the room. If the founder were still involved in daily operations, perhaps this discussion would be different. But the company must move forward. Victor lowered his eyes slightly. That comment clearly bothered him. Daniel, however, remained composed. He finally pushed the door open slowly. The large conference room fell silent almost instantly. 12 members of the board sat around a long table covered in digital tablets, financial reports, and printed briefing documents. At the far end of the table, the chairman was in the middle of a sentence when the door opened. His words stopped abruptly. One by one, the board members turned toward the entrance. At first, their expressions showed irritation at the interruption, then confusion, then something closer to disbelief. Daniel Hale stood in the doorway with the calm presence of someone who had nothing to prove and nothing to hide. Victor remained a step behind him. For several seconds, no one spoke. Finally, the chairman leaned forward slightly, his voice careful and uncertain. Mr. Hale, he said slowly, we were not expecting you this morning. Daniel stepped into the room, his eyes moving calmly across the faces of the people who had just been discussing the future of his company without him. "I gathered that," he replied quietly. The silence inside the conference room stretched longer than anyone expected. 12 members of the board sat around the long walnut table, their eyes fixed on the man who had just walked through the door. Daniel Hale did not rush to speak. He stepped fully into the room and closed the door behind him with a quiet click that seemed louder than it should have been. The board chairman leaned back slowly in his chair, studying Daniel with careful attention. The last time most of them had seen him in person had been during the anniversary celebration 3 years earlier. Back then he had stood on a stage with cameras flashing and investors applauding. Seeing him here now, unannounced and standing quietly in the doorway, felt very different. The chairman cleared his throat. "Mr. Hale," he said again, his tone measured but tense, "we did not expect you to be present for this meeting." Daniel walked a few steps toward the table. His eyes moved across each board member in turn. Some of the faces were familiar allies from the early years of the company. Others were newer investors whose involvement had begun only after the company valuation crossed several $billion. "I understand that," Daniel replied calmly. Victor Langston remained near the door behind him, observing the room with silent focus. One of the board members shifted uncomfortably in his chair and glanced down at the financial reports spread across the table. Another quietly closed a digital tablet, as if unsure whether the meeting was still proceeding as planned. The chairman folded his hands together. "Since you are here, perhaps you would like to take a seat," he said, gesturing toward the empty chair at the end of the table. Daniel glanced at the chair, but did not sit immediately. Instead, he walked slowly around the room, stopping beside the wide window that overlooked the city skyline. From that height, the buildings of Chicago appeared almost peaceful beneath the bright morning light. 15 years ago, he had stood in a much smaller office looking at the same skyline and imagining what the future might look like if patience and discipline carried them far enough. He turned back toward the table. "I heard part of your discussion before entering the room," Daniel said quietly. Several board members shifted again, suddenly aware that their earlier comments might not have been as private as they assumed. The chairman maintained his composed expression. "Then you understand the purpose of this meeting," he replied. "We are evaluating a merger proposal that could accelerate the company expansion across international markets." Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes, I heard that as well." Another board member leaned forward. "The proposal is supported by detailed projections," he said quickly, sliding a printed report across the table as if evidence alone could justify the moment. "With the additional capital and infrastructure from the international firm, we could double our transaction network within 5 years. Daniel glanced at the report, but did not pick it up. "And what happens to the company leadership structure after the merger?" he asked calmly. The question hung in the air. The chairman answered carefully. Strategic leadership would transition into a shared executive framework with oversight from the expanded board. Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Share control," he said. "That is one way to describe it." Another board member spoke up. "The founder role would remain respected, of course." The word respected sounded polite, but hollow. Daniel finally walked toward the empty chair at the end of the table and rested one hand lightly on the back of it. For a moment, he simply looked at the group of people seated around him. Many of them had helped guide the company through difficult years. Others had arrived when the company's success was already established. Daniel's voice remained steady when he spoke again. "Before this discussion continues," he said quietly, "there is something all of you should understand about the structure of Hale Meridian Holdings." The board members exchanged uncertain glances. Daniel continued. "When this company was first formed, the legal framework included a clause designed to protect its long-term independence." The chairman frowned slightly. "I am familiar with the corporate structure," he replied. Daniel's eyes remained calm. "Then you know that no merger agreement involving controlling influence can be approved without one final authorization." The chairman's expression tightened slightly. "What authorization are you referring to?" Daniel looked directly at him. "Mine," he said. The word "mine" did not echo loudly, yet it seemed to settle over the entire conference room like a sudden change in air pressure. Several members of the board shifted in their seats almost at the same moment. Papers that had been neatly arranged across the long table suddenly looked less certain, as if the numbers printed on them were no longer the most important part of the meeting. The chairman leaned forward slowly, his fingers still interlocked on the polished surface of the table. "Mr. Hale," he said carefully, "the corporate structure has evolved over the years." Daniel remained standing beside the chair, one hand resting lightly against its back. "Yes," he replied calmly. "It has grown, but the original legal framework has not changed." One of the board members near the center of the table glanced quickly toward a thick binder of governance documents that sat beside her tablet. Another member quietly adjusted his glasses and began scrolling through files on a digital screen in front of him. The room had shifted from confident discussion to cautious verification. Victor Langston watched the scene from near the door, his arms loosely at his sides. For the first time since the meeting began, the board appeared uncertain about the ground beneath their decision. The chairman cleared his throat again. "Even if such a clause exists," he said slowly, "the board still maintains authority to evaluate strategic partnerships for the company future." Daniel nodded once. "Authority to evaluate, yes. Authority to transfer controlling influence without founder approval, no." He paused for a moment, allowing the difference between those two statements to settle into the room. One of the younger board members leaned forward. "Mr. Hale," he said, "the merger is not intended to erase your legacy." The word legacy lingered awkwardly in the air. Daniel looked toward the man with a calm expression. "Legacy is what people talk about when they think something is finished," he replied quietly. "Hale Meridian Holdings is not finished." Another board member spoke up, this one an early investor who had joined the company during its second year of growth. "Daniel," he said more gently, "the international firm brings resources we cannot ignore. Their infrastructure would allow us to enter markets that would normally take a decade to reach." Daniel listened without interrupting. When the man finished speaking, Daniel slowly walked around the end of the table until he stood directly across from the chairman. "I'm not opposed to growth," he said. "I built this company because I believed growth was possible." The chairman studied him carefully. "Then why object to the merger?" he asked. Daniel shook his head slightly. "I do not object to the idea of partnership. I object to surrendering the independence that allowed this company to exist in the first place." The board members exchanged glances again. Daniel's voice remained steady and thoughtful. "When Hale Meridian Holdings began, we were told many times that our vision was unrealistic. We were told the financial technology world did not need another platform. We were told that patience and discipline were not strong enough to compete with institutions that had existed for generations." He paused, letting the memory of those early years fill the quiet room. "Yet we built something strong enough that an international firm now wants to stand beside it." Daniel looked around the table at each face. That success did not come from chasing approval. It came from protecting the principles that built the company foundation. The chairman leaned back slightly in his chair, considering the words carefully. "And what do you propose instead?" he asked. Daniel rested both hands lightly on the back of the chair in front of him. "I propose that the board remembers something simple." The room waited. Daniel spoke quietly but clearly. "The purpose of Hale Meridian Holdings was never to become the largest company in the room. It was to become the most disciplined one." The silence that followed felt different from the earlier tension. It was not the silence of conflict. It was the silence of people realizing that the conversation had changed direction. Daniel finally pulled the chair out and sat down at the end of the table. The founder's seat that had been empty moments earlier was no longer empty. "Now," he said calmly, "let's talk about the future of this company together." For several seconds after Daniel Hale sat down, the conference room remained quiet in a way that felt heavier than before. The empty chair at the end of the table had always symbolized the founder presence, even when he was not physically there. Now that he occupied it again, the balance of the room had changed. The board members looked at one another carefully, as if recalculating every assumption that had guided the meeting earlier that morning. The chairman slowly leaned back in his chair and studied Daniel with a different expression now. It was no longer the controlled authority he had shown earlier. It was something closer to reflection. "Mr. Hale," he said finally, No one here intends to erase the principles that built this company. Daniel folded his hands calmly on the table. I believe that, he replied. But sometimes decisions made too quickly can do exactly that without anyone intending it. One of the senior investors who had been silent for most of the meeting cleared his throat. Daniel, he said, when a merger proposal was introduced, it was presented as the safest path for the next phase of expansion. Markets are shifting quickly. Competition is growing. The board believed the international firm could help us move faster. Daniel nodded slowly. Speed can be useful, he said. But speed without direction often leads companies away from the very strengths that made them valuable in the first place. Another board member looked down at the stack of reports in front of her and then back toward Daniel. If the merger is not the right path, she asked carefully, then what do you recommend instead? Daniel did not answer immediately. He glanced toward the large window at the far end of the conference room, where the skyline of Chicago stretched outward in bright afternoon light. For a moment, he seemed to be thinking not about numbers, but about the long chain of decisions that had brought the company to this point. When he finally spoke, his voice remained calm and steady. 15 years ago, when this company began, we did not have the fastest technology or the largest financial backing. What we had was patience and the willingness to build something carefully rather than quickly. He looked back around the table. That same discipline is what allowed Hale Meridian Holdings to grow into a company strong enough to attract international attention. Victor Langston remained near the door, listening quietly as the conversation shifted. The chairman glanced down at the documents in front of him once more before slowly closing the folder that contained the merger proposal. Perhaps the question we should be asking is not whether the merger brings opportunity, he said thoughtfully, but whether it protects the independence that made those opportunities possible. Daniel gave a small nod. That is the question I hoped we would reach. The room remained silent for a moment as each board member considered the implications. Finally, the senior investor who had spoken earlier leaned back in his chair and sighed quietly. I joined this company during its second year, he said. Back then there were fewer than 20 employees and the servers overheated every summer. He allowed himself a faint smile at the memory. I invested because I believed. The founder vision was different from the rest of the industry. He looked toward the other board members. Perhaps the safest decision today is not to move faster, but to remember why we believed in this company in the first place. The chairman nodded slowly. He opened the folder one last time and then closed it again with quiet finality. In that case, I propose we postpone the merger vote until a full strategic review is conducted with the founder present. Several board members nodded in agreement. No one objected. The tension that had filled the room earlier slowly dissolved into something calmer and more thoughtful. Daniel remained seated at the end of the table, his posture relaxed but attentive. After a moment, the chairman looked toward him again. It appears the meeting you walked into this morning may have ended differently than expected, he said. Daniel allowed a small, quiet smile. Sometimes the most important decisions simply require the right people to be in the room when they are made, he replied. The meeting did not end with applause or dramatic declarations. It ended the way the most important decisions in serious companies often do, with quiet understanding. The board members slowly gathered their papers and closed their tablets while the tension that had filled the room earlier faded into thoughtful silence. Outside the tall glass windows, the afternoon sun had begun to shift across the skyline of Chicago, casting long reflections across the buildings below. Daniel Hale remained seated at the end of the long conference table for a moment after the others stood. He watched as the directors spoke quietly among themselves, their voices no longer defensive or hurried. The chairman walked toward him after the others began leaving the room. His expression carried a humility that had not been present earlier that morning. Mr. Hale, he said calmly, I believe this company just avoided making a decision that might have changed its future in ways we did not fully understand. Daniel looked up at him with a calm expression. Companies rarely fail because of bad opportunities, he replied. They fail because people forget why the company was built in the first place. The chairman nodded slowly. I think many of us needed that reminder. One by one, the other board members approached Daniel before leaving the room. Some thanked him quietly. Others simply nodded with a kind of respectful acknowledgement that had not existed earlier in the meeting. Victor Langston remained near the doorway until the room was almost empty. When the final director stepped out into the hallway, Victor closed the door softly and turned toward Daniel. That meeting could have gone very differently, he said. Daniel stood and walked slowly toward the window overlooking the city. Chicago stretched wide beneath them, the same city where his parents had worked long hours to keep their small family moving forward year after year. The same streets where he had once carried a second-hand laptop through winter snowstorms because he believed an idea could become something real. The truth is, Daniel said quietly, the company is strong enough to survive many challenges. What matters is whether the people guiding it remember what kind of company it was meant to be. Victor nodded thoughtfully. I think they remember now. Daniel allowed a small smile and then turned toward the door. As they stepped back into the hallway, the building felt different from when he had first walked in that morning. Word of his arrival had already spread through the upper floors. Employees passing in the hallway paused for a moment when they recognized him, their expressions shifting from surprise to quiet respect. When the elevator doors opened again, Daniel and Victor stepped inside. The ride down through the glass atrium was silent except for the soft hum of the cables. Below them, the lobby floor slowly came back into view. When the doors opened on the ground level, several employees who had witnessed the earlier scene looked toward him again. The security guard who had first asked him to leave the building stood near the reception desk, clearly aware of the mistake he had made that morning. Daniel walked calmly across the marble floor toward the exit. The guard stepped forward awkwardly, his voice careful. "Sir, I did not realize earlier." Daniel raised a hand gently before the man could continue. "You were doing your job," he said, "and you were protecting the company." The guard looked relieved, but still embarrassed. Daniel turned toward the glass doors and paused for a moment before stepping outside into the Chicago afternoon. The city noise returned immediately, traffic moving through the streets just as it had every day for decades. Victor stood beside him for a moment on the steps of the building. "I imagine the board will call you later today to continue the discussion," he said. Daniel looked back up at the tall tower of Hale Meridian Holdings rising above them. "They will," he replied calmly. Then he added with a quiet confidence that carried the weight of 15 years of work. "Not because I walked into the building today, but because they finally remembered who built it.